Well, I'm going to open this thing up here and get this started, but while I do, I did want to point out that there are some differences between myself and a lot of folks here at the conference. And I'm not talking about the obvious physical differences that I don't have any gray hair or that I do have gray hair. Sorry, Dennis. But I'm an economist. I'm a policy analyst, and I focus on energy policy particularly. And I know a lot of the folks, even on this panel, and let me get this up here. I know a lot of folks on this panel are doctors, and there it is. I found it. I took care of it. She was coming to save me. Are doctors and scientists, and they deal a lot with the climate change science aspect of things. And I'm not going to cover that today for the most part. I am going to cover energy policy. And I think this presentation is important for you folks to put it into perspective on how energy policy, climate policy, economics, and health and welfare are all connected. I do work for the American Legislative Exchange Council. We've gotten a few things of bad PR recently, just like the Heartland Institute has, but we're making it through, and we're still producing great work. Last month, we released Economy Derailed, State-by-State Impacts of the EPA Regulatory Trainwreck, which in this presentation, I'm going to hit some of the highlights that were found in that report. But I wanted to start with a specific example. A story that really tells where the EPA has gone today and what the EPA has become today versus what it was about 40 years ago. In December of 2011, the EPA unveiled one of the most costly regulations on the electric power industry in history. It's known as the Utility MACT rule, the Mercury and Air Toxics rule. EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson unveiled this regulation at the Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C., where in her very short speech, it was probably about a minute, she mentioned children or protecting children 8 times. Now, because of these tactics, it's not surprising that Americans view environmental quality in a very pessimistic way. Large majorities in the poll think Americans are thinking that environmental quality is getting worse, not better. Unfortunately, that's not true. The EPA is only telling one part of the story, and they're telling it in a very misleading way. Let's dive in on this one specific regulation, and then we'll move forward on it. The Mercury and Air Toxic Standard, what the EPA failed to leave out, is that mercury emissions have been declining for decades, and this regulation would have little to no impact on people's exposure to mercury whatsoever. Even a former EPA Assistant Administrator for Air and Radiation explains, if you could eliminate all mercury emissions in the U.S., you would have almost no impact on people's exposure. Now, why is that? Mainly, natural sources outweigh man-made sources, and also the primary exposure method is ingestion of seafood derived from foreign shores. The EPA even reluctantly admits this. The EPA's highest benefit estimate for this rule is $500,000 to $6 million per year. Its cost estimate is $10.9 billion a year. Now, I use the EPA's cost estimate because ultimately industry estimates show significantly higher. But even at the EPA's own estimates, you're looking at cost outweighing benefits 1,800 to 1. Obviously, that does not make sense. Now, also what the EPA conveniently left out in their speech was that mercury emissions since 1990 alone have declined 58%. But that trend is not necessarily defined just to mercury, but all traditional pollutants. I'm not talking carbon dioxide, but traditional pollutants, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, particulate matter, fine particulate matter, ozone, carbon monoxide, and even lead have decreased in both ambient concentrations in the atmosphere and total emissions overall. So if the justification of continuously ratcheting down regulations, making them more stringent, becomes less clear, and if the cost-benefit analyses are not penciling out, then what is this all really about? Well, cap and trade is dead in Congress. Clean energy standard, which would force Americans to purchase politically preferred renewable energy sources, is a political non-starter. So the EPA has become the political go-to tool to force a global warming and clean energy agenda on American citizens. And it's being used in that way through a variety of regulations. In the past few years, the regulatory activity coming out of the EPA would supersede its entire 40-year history of regulation. Economy Derailed, the report that I authored recently, highlights 9 major EPA actions that are going to be attacking the energy sector of the economy. And in the next few slides, I'm going to cover a few of them, not all of them, but a few of them, and then how that's going to impact health and welfare of United States citizens. The rule that we were discussing earlier, the Mercury and Air Toxics Rule, would require retrofits for 753 electricity generating units across the country and has been deemed the most costly EPA regulation in history. More than 15 gigawatts of electricity could be forced into early retirement. What does 15 gigawatts mean? Let's put that into perspective. That's enough energy to power approximately 10 million U.S. households. And the compliance, the standards are so stringent that no new coal plants are likely to be built. In fact, even when they released the carbon dioxide standard recently in March, they stated that there was no cost of the carbon dioxide standard. Why did they? Because there's no coal plants going to be built because of other rules. The cross-state air pollution rule, which Paul mentioned as well, would reduce emissions that cross state lines. This could threaten 7 gigawatts with early retirement, enough energy to power approximately 5 million U.S. households. Depending upon the type of technology used, the cost of compliance could run up to $120 billion by 2015. What's interesting to note as well is that the EPA used outdated data, a few years old data, even though they had newer data available to them at the time. And it inflated the non-attainment areas with the strict standard by 1,200%. If they'd used the newest data, they would have found that virtually every area was in compliance, and the ones that weren't would have been in compliance with existing regulations in place by 2014. The EPA is also considering a broad regulation to force fossil fuel generation and some nuclear capacity to switch their once-through cooling systems with cooling towers. Extremely costly proposition. It could affect more than 1,000 electricity generating units across the country and could threaten a significant amount of electricity coming offline in the next few years. Coal ash as well. The EPA is wants to regulate coal combustion residues and classify them as hazardous waste. Now, the states already regulate coal ash pretty significantly. They store it in liquid form at surface impoundments and solid form at landfills, and a significant percentage of it is actually beneficially recycled in random things like bowling balls and even drywall. The cost of this rule could be $1.5 billion per year, according to the EPA. Industry estimates put it at $20 billion annually, and it could force a number of coal plants across the United States to shut down. But the EPA is not only at war with coal-fired generation, they're also at war with coal mining. Due to the numerous overlapping regulations already coming out in the next few years, we're looking at 27,000 coal mining jobs lost and a $15 billion hit to the industry, mainly due to the lack of demand of coal because these plants are shutting down. But the Obama administration is also looking at reinterpreting the Surface Mining and Reclamation Act. And they're looking at rewriting the stream buffer zone, a move that would essentially ban mountaintop mining across the United States. The Department of Interior claims that this would take 7,000 jobs out, and coal mining would decline or stay flat in 20 states. Other estimates put the coal mining-related job losses at 270,000. Environmental groups are also petitioning the EPA to include coal mines in Clean Air Act new source performance standards, another burdensome regulation that will shut coal mine down across the country. Greenhouse gas regulations. This one has received the lion's share of attention, both at this conference and across the United States. The other ones haven't, but this one has. On March 27th, the EPA proposed a carbon dioxide standard for new power plants. Existing power plants and oil refineries are next on the list. But what's interesting about this is that the Clean Air Act requires a category for regulation to include new and modified sources. The EPA said that they will not enforce the modified provision of the Clean Air Act with this rule. Now, it is a law, though. And you know that environmental lawyers have already set up their paperwork to sue any coal-fired power plant that happens to modify to comply with any of the other regulations, meaning litigation ends up being regulation without representation, and that's a way to get at the entire existing coal fleet in the United States. But what's even more interesting to note is that the regulation shows its true intentions. First of all, they didn't list any costs. They say that this rule won't cost anything at all. The next thing is it said there's no health benefits. They didn't calculate a single health benefit for this rule whatsoever. But they did say this proposed rule is consistent with the President's goal to ensure by 2035 we'll generate 80% of our electricity from clean energy sources. The EPA has become a tool to move a clean energy agenda by the administration. Even EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson said in the press release, this will move us into a new era of American energy. But the EPA pushed back and they said, no, coal-fired is okay, as long as you use carbon capture and sequestration, the commercially unproven process of storing carbon dioxide in geological deposits. Now, they did admit that this can't be done without federal assistance, I guess energy welfare, and they readily admit that fossil fuel capacity is not going to be coal for the next 20 years at least. So because of this, we highlighted over 130 major power plants across the country that are going to be shut down in the next few years due to a slew, this regulatory onslaught coming out from the EPA. This obviously affects reliability and price of electricity. Due to just 5 EPA regulations, not even greenhouse gas emissions, we're looking at 11 states could see rate increases of over 20%, on average 10.35% across the country. Iowa sees the largest potential rate increase of 32%. And this is where it comes back, and it ties back in with human health and welfare. Paul said it in the best way possible. Energy is the lifeblood of the economy. And truly what you see here is access to affordable and reliable energy has led this nation to be one of the greatest nations on the planet. And it's also led to a significant increase in standard of living and life expectancy. And threatening reliable and affordable generation, which is the EPA is doing now, is also threatening human health by affecting households directly. Now, I want to put this into kind of household terms on this. 50% of U.S. households make less than $50,000 a year. These households are in a precarious situation with the EPA actions. They spend more on energy than they do on food, twice as much on energy than they do on health care, and more on energy than anything else except for housing. When you increase the cost of energy through a utility MACT rule, cross-state air pollution rule, you are diverting household income away from health-promoting activities like healthcare, healthy food, exercise, towards the increasing regulatory burden put on by families. This conference is extremely important to get this information out, and not just to the public, but to policymakers that are doing these types of things on the Hill and also in your state legislatures. So I appreciate you inviting me here to speak and covering these issues. And a little plug, visit regulatorytrainwreck.com to find out where your state lands as far as the economic impact of the EPA. Thank you.